are listening to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Banatini, and I'm the host. Today, we actually had two really interesting guests, one PhD candidate and one postdoc. The PhD candidate was Govaart, and the postdoc was Dr. Lieneke Janssen. And they're both at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig. And they have started a open science organization there that basically fosters open science good practices. And we had a great discussion about what that actually entailed, how you actually start a grassroots sort of movement. And of course, they receive the blessings of their directors, but it really is sort of a bottom-up sort of approach. And it involves, everything from, and we had a great discussion about this, how do you actually incentivize people to do open science best practices? Everything from pre-registration, which we talked about extensively, and how it actually fosters better science and doesn't really impose limits as people might think. And how do you actually then go from incentivizing people to fundamentally changing the culture? And that's the goal, is to change the culture of science in this regard. And so we talked about that. We talked about the benefits of open science, some of the challenges. And the discussion actually got more wide-ranging at the end, in which we talked about how it extends beyond simply how you do your science, but it also extends to how you share your data, how you share your results, how do you include and offer opportunities to diverse individuals and cultures and groups. And so, and not only that, I mean, we talked a little bit at the very end about potentially changing the system of review for papers and for research grants, more with a long-term eye, at least on some of them, as opposed to short-term gains. So it was a great discussion that started small and ended up big. I hope you enjoy it. All right. Welcome to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Banatini. Here I interview neuroscientists and discuss their work, as well as the latest developments, issues, and controversies in the field of brain mapping. Open science and all that it entails has been something that's been advanced in the field of brain imaging in many ways for many reasons over the years. And today, the trend is picking up momentum with local, regional, and international open science initiatives starting up. In fact, where I work in NIMH, I even started a data sharing team back in 2016, headed up by Adam Thomas, to foster open science practices. But there's obviously more to it than just that. And other groups are doing different things. At the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, an open science initiative was started as a grassroots movement by the students and postdocs, officially beginning their initiative on Open Science Day, their talks on May 23rd of 2019. So it's been going on for a little while. And today I talk with two individuals closely involved with this particular movement at the MPI in Leipzig to talk about their own group and their own initiative at Leipzig and open science in general, why it's important, what it entails, how to engage more people in it. So to begin, Gisela Govaart, she's a PhD candidate at the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig and the Einstein Center for Neuroscience. Her current research is focused on developmental cognitive neuroscience, early language acquisition, phoneme acquisition, and voice processing in infancy. Dr. Lieneke Janssen. Her research focused topics include reinforcement learning and decision-making, habitual and goal-directed control behavior, compulsivity in obesity and addiction, the role of dopamine in compulsive behavior, mechanisms of mindfulness, and behavioral paradigms, neuroimaging and interventions, both pharmacological and behavioral. So even though I introduced both of you and destroyed your names in the process, why don't you introduce yourselves and just say a little bit about yourself as well, just so people can associate your name with your voice. Whoever wants to start, maybe Gisela. Yeah, Gisela.
Yeah, so I'll repronounce my name.
Okay, sorry.
That was completely fine. Yeah, my name is actually Gisela Govaart. So I'm actually in the neuropsychology department with Professor Federici, and then I'm in the early language acquisition group with Claudia Miller. And I work on early language acquisition. Yeah, in my PhD, what I do is I use EEG to investigate phoneme acquisition in infancy and the role of voice information in that process.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Lieneke Janssen. It was actually a very good job also. Like, these Dutch names are difficult. I'm also Dutch. I currently work as a postdoc in the O-Brain lab. And you mentioned already, or we are investigating decision-making in diet-induced obesity. That's the short story, with a strong focus on the role of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And like the methods that we use it's a combination of behavioral neuroimaging, but also physiological measurements.
Okay. Well, we can definitely talk about how your own research lends itself to open science, or how you would do your studies differently with open science versus not open science approaches. So just as a point of reference, so are there any other people that you would want to mention that might be involved in this project?
So there's actually many. That makes us a bit reluctant to mention names. We have a very dynamic team with very variable engagement levels, or yeah, exactly. I think the main point here is that our team consists predominantly of early career researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive Brain Sciences. Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, so I'm actually I know very well of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and you know, it's interesting. I visited there a few years ago, and it's a great place. I mean, there's Angelo Federici, which I think she's still the director, right? Is she or okay? And then yeah, Arno Willinger, Nicholas Weisskopf, Christian Doller. So which group are you in, Annika?
I'm in the neurology department with Arno Wilringer.
Okay. Okay, great.
But we have in the team, we have people from all different departments, and also independent research groups. That's quite nice for our initiative, that it really crosses. It's really across departments, and I think that's important. Yeah.
So, okay, so let's just to begin, what initially motivated you to start this initiative? You know, what was it? Some sort of thing that you thought, oh, what we're doing is wrong, or is there, was there? I mean, you said you emphasize in your blog post that it was sort of a bottom up sort of thing. So, what motivated you, and how did you actually get it going?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. I think it was by the end of 2018 that it was quite clear that there was a growing interest in open science practices, and in particular in the topic of pre-registration. You would hear the topic more and more in hallway conversations at coffee machines. That was the informal part. But also in institute-wide meetings, the topic would come up. So the question would come up, hey, did you consider pre-registering your study? Why not? Or how did you do that? But what also became quite clear is that so many people were struggling with how to really go about it. Where do you start if you pre-register your study? Can I even invest my precious time? Who can I ask for advice? And that's actually like this that's when we started talking about it more and more, and that sort of momentum we used to start this grassroots initiative, with the blessing of the directors of the institute. That was an important motivation, actually, to get an initiative, to get organized, and to get started.
Yeah. And so it just started mostly through pre-registration, through the idea, the discussion of like things like pre-registration.
So that, I think, was the main topic that kept coming back. There were definitely other topics that, if you would ask people what aspects of open science they would like to work on or are interested in, that they would mention, like it's like data sharing. But pre-registration came back mostly. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, as far as that's concerned, your initial offering was sort of like, well, basically it was sort of like the idea that let's maybe start to change the culture in some sense, or start talking about it. And I see on your website as well that you offer, some training or maybe some tools for helping people pre-register, maybe some resources and things like that. Yeah, I can imagine that it's, I mean, we can talk about this more a little bit later, but initially it's hard because, especially, I know Arno and I know Nick Weiskopf as far as getting adherence from the directors, and I know Arno is a little bit, especially Arno, but also maybe Nick a little bit is so my old experiments, like when I used to work, I would have thought, because I think most researchers, and this is the hard part, and maybe we could talk about it now, but the hard part, at least with pre-registration for us, for maybe physicists who just like, they tweak a pulse sequence, they try something, they see if it works on one person, and they maybe do 5 more and write a paper because it's like a proof of concept sort of thing. And it's hard. And and there's certain studies obviously that lend themselves more to pre-registration than others. And I think that's, what would you say about that as far as part of the education? It's not only giving people resources, but sort of, talking to them and saying, hey, pre-registration isn't that hard, or this is how you could do pre-registration.
So it's a very valid point, and it's a discussion that has come up also at the Institute, that it does, like, pre-registration itself might not work for all types of studies, at least not the kind of pre-registration that confirmatory studies. That doesn't mean we shouldn't learn more about it, and we shouldn't learn about the other possibilities. There's also ideas on how to pre-register exploratory studies. For us, so it didn't stop us from setting up this initiative. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now. You mentioned it a bit earlier that, what did you mention? Oh, we'll stop here. Gisela, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, definitely on the topic of pre-registration. I mean, I think what happened with our initiative is that we were just, in the beginning, there was a lot of peer-to-peer information exchange. So we were just all together trying to learn how to do this. There were some people that had already pre-registered and people that were learning, and so we organized a workshop, things like that. But also, like, over the course of the last years, we have been discussing a lot also about certain types of studies that might be a lot more difficult to pre-register, what the actual benefit of pre-registration is. So for me, for example, that's mostly transparency. So I would say that definitely also exploratory research can be pre-registered, or at least also these kind of formats be used as a template to meticulously also document what you're doing. So I think that the cool thing in this initiative is really like this constant learning. So everyone, people have different levels of knowledge, and there's just a lot of information exchange, and you realize like after a while how much you've learned by just interacting with each other. And then when new people enter, you suddenly realize like, hey, all these things that I thought are just completely clear might not be clear for new people. And then you suddenly realize like, hey, okay, so this is what I've learned in a year or a year and a half by basically just interacting with each other. And I think that's really a powerful part.
Can I add to that? So
sure.
Thought that came up, I think of additional value that, like, of course you can like focus on the challenges and where it's difficult, where it can stop you from actually going that way, and increasing your knowledge about how to pre-register or what open science is, to be against. But I think by not focusing on the challenges, but actually the opportunities, you can do exactly what Gisela says. We grew so much over the past years by actually focusing on what's possible and how we can actually try to overcome some of the challenges that are out there.
Yeah. So
and also realizing, sorry, I just want
to go ahead.
add one small thing. Especially for pre-registration, also realizing that it might not be the tool for everyone, right? So maybe your research doesn't lend itself for this, or maybe you prefer another way to increase transparency, and that is and should be completely fine. As long as people understand what pre-registration is and can do, I think that is just basically the main goal.
Yeah. So and I think you're right. I think a lot of people, when they think of pre-registration, they think of something extremely confining, and you know, it does commit you to a certain line. You mentioned one thing that you mentioned about pre-registration. You said that you can also have exploratory studies in pre-registration. How, just out of curiosity, how would that? Let's say somebody wanted to, you know, like, or even the idea, I mean, there's two types. I mean, I think of, like, you know, open science also as like, you know, pooling all your data and sharing your data, and having discovery science, you know, sharing all, you know, that's sort of open science, but that's explicitly not, you know, it's sort of pre-registering it to say, look, there's this data, but now we'll try to find correlations from it that relate. How do those fit together? So how do you have exploratory and pre-registration potentially?
For an exploratory study, you can also, before you start, already pre-register certain things. And then for me, like, if the main benefit is transparency, then you can also just keep a good log of all the things that you're doing, and then you combine these tools basically. Yeah.
I think an interesting point here that came up when we had an fMRI pre-registration template hackathon is that aren't many of the, at least fMRI studies that we are doing, even though we sell them or we say they're confirmatory, or we write the pre-registration or the paper as if it's confirmatory, aren't they actually quite exploratory in nature? I know this is a bit of a, you can debate about that, but I think in the first place it's good to consider, to zoom out a little bit from your own studies and think, okay, is this really a confirmatory study or is it exploratory? And when then pre-registering that study, you can totally also write a protocol as specific as you can for your plans for exploration. That might not be the picture perfect pre-registration as some people consider pre-registration should be of confirmatory studies, but it's not impossible, and it's definitely worth the while, I think.
Okay. And I would also say it can be a picture perfect pre-registration for an exploratory study, right? Because there are different things that you would need.
It's just that the emphasis of pre-registering is often on confirmatory studies, and that's not always made very explicit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Okay. All right. Yeah, no, I can see how you could actually have many different, like you said, many different types of pre-registration, and as long as it's you specify what you're looking for ahead of time, and within a certain time frame, and be very transparent about the methods that you use. Yeah, anything to avoid. Right. I think that one of the big problems with neuroimaging data is so multidimensional. It's so rich that we're still trying to figure out how to look at it. But at the same time, there's that risk for doing p-hacking, where you just sort of figure out what looks good, and then say, oh, well, that was we hypothesized that this happens, and it happens. So it avoids that sort of loop. And even though that's great, so that's actually an interesting thing. So with pre-registration, it's always interesting if you don't find something that you're looking for, but you do find something else. Yeah, you can still report it, but it's not like what you were looking for, I guess. And
you just have to be clear. It's all about transparency, as Gisela already said.
Yeah.
And maybe the papers get a bit more, I don't want to say dull, but they might get a bit more rich and less of a fancy story to just sell results. But I think that would be a good development in science. Of course, it has to be still readable, and the important facts should not disappear in a long list of things that you've done. But you can definitely,
Yeah, no, I'm definitely think that having, and actually that's an interesting question as well. So anyway, let me just go a little bit further on here. So, you mentioned the bottom-up approach again, and so basically, you got the endorsement, it's the okay from your directors, and then you probably had organization, you work together across. Across the groups, and just talking to researchers and whatever, and so okay, so you got that going in that sense. So do you think there's an advantage, like you were mentioning in your blog, that there's a lot of times where you have like a position statement by the directors. Let's say the directors got together and said, oh, this is very important, but it may not have the same ability to be actually implemented if it's top down versus bottom up. I mean, a lot of times most things are sort of top down in a sense where the OHBM might say this is an important thing, or the standards committee might say this is, you should be doing this. But your bottom up, I think, does sort of touch upon, the individual researchers within a group. It's sort of on that scale where you sort of help. But is there a way that you're trying to, it seems like there's many open science initiatives sort of springing up all over the place. And it seems that they tie into, they have their resources. Is there any, or it might be premature, like a sense of trying to become a network, sort of to coordinate your open science initiatives across other groups? You mentioned the Netherlands, you mentioned some other groups, but is there, it seems like there's potential of forming, some sort of consortium.
Joining forces, right? That would be great.
Yeah.
But let me first say something about the grassroots, the advantage of that. So I think even though the support of the directors really helped to get started, first of all, to motivate people or to encourage people to join the team. Second, to get resources to actually organize an Open Science Day. And this is, I have to admit, we are quite privileged to be able to do that. But so I think the organization that we have really, how to put it, we reach really a lot of people in the Institute. we are also quite active. What did I say? Why did I say that? You started off by what how did you start your question again?
To form like a bigger network across other institutes, or
so yeah, that was the second part. But before, yeah, okay, we'll get to the second part.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But that's actually an interesting. But let me just when you say you're active within the institute, it really is. Yeah, I mean, and I'll talk about this a little bit. Sort of the attempts of changing the culture of how people think about doing their research. I mean, that seems like it's really hard in that regard.
It is. It's very hard to get people to change. They have to be motivated themselves to change, and that we try to do by empowering them to use more open science or good scientific practices, however you want to call it. And by doing it bottom up, I think we reach quite a large audience that will take it with them to higher levels on the academic ladder. And that's slowly that will be the change that we need. Of course, we need also change now, but we need to make structural changes that last, that are carried on to throughout academic careers.
Yeah, and the fact that we're a bottom-up initiative with mostly early career researchers also means that the threshold is extremely low, I think, for people to join. That the threshold is low to ask questions, that there is really like easy opportunities, I would say, to learn. And I think maybe the most powerful way to change people is really by letting them learn, right? By not posing things upon people, but by really having this information exchange between people, and also letting people decide which practices fit for their research, and that they can do it step by step. You don't have to do everything in your first project. You can
that's a good point.
First start with one practice and then add things on top. And the more I think you push people, you can also get quite the opposite effect.
Yeah. I think that actually, right. I agree. I think that at least at the NIH, we're trying to foster, for instance, data sharing or things like that. I mean, to change the culture of science, it seems that the incentives, are a big aspect. I mean, you can't just, if you have a top down, there's an advantage. There's one advantage of doing top down is that you can just impose this rule. But that's obviously not the ideal way. You want to have a change in the culture such that people will want to see an advantage. And this is the tricky part, because everyone right now, as they're learning about this, they think, oh, this is good, but is it really, like you were saying before, like educating people on how it actually helps your paper have a higher impact?
Well, what are the benefits, right? So,
right,
and
exactly.
And how do they differ for different people? Like there is a huge variety in kind of benefits that can drive people to change their behavior.
Right.
One example there is like what we've heard repeatedly is, hey, can you give us some numbers of how or measures of how open science helps science? That is one way of going about that. You have a sort of evidence-based use of open science practices. I'm not so convinced that is necessary. So I personally believe that it should be a given to practice science transparently, try to increase reproducibility, because these are important values. We want to get at a truth rather than cool stories. We want to build knowledge together rather than just competitively. These should basically be the values that drive the work that we do. And if that's, if you really need evidence, so I'm not so convinced of measurable effects of open science. Although I totally understand that for like, given the brief contracts many people have, or fixed term contracts, there have to be some benefits, and that can also be in the shape of a bit increased financial or job security. But that's a very different kind of benefit than, for example, an evidence-based way of practicing open science.
Yeah.
What do we need?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm thinking in terms of, right, I mean, you know, my own struggles at the NIH, actually, I mean, just basically saying, oh, so apart from pre-registration or best practices, and hopefully the culture will be such that, I mean, obviously people just want to get their paper out and they'd like to have the highest impact, but also they get reviewed. And that's potentially a top-down thing. I mean, they get reviewed, you know, in terms of promotions or, you know, and once the culture sort of permeates, that can kind of bubble up to the top, and then people can start saying, hey, how many pre-registered reports do you have? And as opposed to how many papers in Nature you have, you know, that's
how much data do you share, etc.
Right. And I think that's, I mean, it sort of starts the ground level and it kind of goes up and iterates. And I think that you know, Max Planck is similar to the NIH in some sense, where, you know, you're under this sort of you know, there's a certain amount of control that you can influence people, whereas academic institutions seem like they're a little bit more, you know, each PI is like a little kingdom unto themselves, and they do what they want, and it seems like in Max Planck or the NIH, where you have, you know, groups that are all, you know, they have a budget and they're all potential for coordinating things better in that regard. So and also still not to say that bottom up is important, but having that cohesion, it might be a good place for these sort of initiatives to really take hold in that regard, where you have more, a little bit more cohesion across groups. It seems.
I think basically like the empowering of open science should happen at all academic stages.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Or career stages, sorry. So even though we do this grassroots initiative, we also do try to reach across all career stages. We really try to include the directors and senior researchers to also support staff. So it's not just about researchers. Even. I think that's important to include the whole bunch, basically.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you say about permeating through different layers, I think is very important, because if you just start with some top-down rules or guides, then it's also always the question, who is going to set these rules and who is going to set these guides, which will, of course, always be the more powerful voices that might have very different needs than, for example, early career researchers or people from different research cultures also. So
there's conflicting goals, right?
Exactly. And therefore it's also, I think it's not only important to think about benefits for certain open science practices, but also how certain open science practices could potentially harm certain people at certain career stages, and to also discuss that and to see how you can sort of mitigate these effects.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually a really good point. Yeah, I mean, you don't want, right, the people in power just sort of creating rules or situations that help them and sort of at the expense of others. Having it grassroots driven and sort of iterating in some sense would be ideal. But it does seem that we're at this early stage. Like, you know, when I look around, you know, I see Talia Coney, who sort of like was an early proponent of everything like this. Russ Poldrack, you know, he has his open neuro, you know, in which it goes even, you know, it's pre-registration, code sharing, data sharing, you know, standards, bids, things like that. And it does seem that right now we're kind of at this stage where there are, you know, you're a little bit ahead of the game in terms of your group starting things up in your group, but it is nice to see that there's other potential groups starting up. And it would be really cool to sort of have that sort of start to crystallize and from the bottom up and crystallize and change the culture in that regard. And actually, and I think what you were saying, a big aspect of this is not really understanding what it means. I mean, everyone's researchers get trained in their method. They might get trained in statistics. They might get trained in, the brain. And then they just ask their questions. And so, part of a graduate student's job is sort of like just to figure out how to ask better questions that are testable. And this could be part of it. I mean, this could be, a big part of that. And I think that it's really great what you're doing as far as that's concerned. Are there other, okay, so are there other ways so there's pre-registration, there's tools. Are you trying to, it seems a very practical thing that people could see immediate benefit from is sharing code or sharing data. Are you trying to take that on at your center as well?
Yeah, so sharing code is not a big topic, although I think many would like to doing it, or like to be doing that. The data sharing topic is a bigger point, at the same time also an issue, because we work with these complex neuroimaging data that are very hard, if not impossible, to anonymize. And with the current legislation in Europe, it's really difficult to share these data, and at least it requires some work. And we have in the Institute a data protection officer who spent a lot of time on figuring that out. Should we say something else about that? Gisela, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think this is something that we have been discussing a lot over the last years, so in collaboration with our data protection officers, and we're still trying to figure out what possible best practices would be with the kind of data that most people in our institute have to deal with. It's a very interesting topic. It's also complex because it also requires actually knowledge about certain, how do you say this, like law things?
About legislation.
Like legal issues.
Legal issues that might
that are
we're not experts on,
and that are not necessarily very black or white. Like
exactly.
That's tricky. Like it's very challenging. I'm definitely at the NIH. We have, we're trying to form a pooled data set, and anytime you have that, the first question is it properly made anonymous? And you're like, well, of course. I mean, some people think it's really easy. Some people think, oh, you just take off the face if it's 3-dimensional data, and then other people might say, well, it's you can still look at brain gyral patterns that can identify people if you really are looking carefully. You put that into a machine learning algorithm, you can easily identify features and so then where would you want to draw that line in terms of, and also a big thing that we have that's a problem is you write a protocol for doing a study, and certain groups don't allow the data to be analyzed in different ways that's different from that protocol.
It depends on the ethics approval you get, right?
Right, right. And so that all has to be somehow worked through. I don't think it's impossible, and I don't think you'll ever get a perfect answer. I think that the better our machine learning approaches are, the more you'll be able to sort of identify features that are unique to individuals. And that's almost impossible. I mean, it's sort of exactly as opposed to another goal of fMRI, and that is to identify individuals. is to sort of say, oh, this individual has schizophrenia, or this individual has this problem. And so it's it's a hard, I mean, it's going to be interesting. And that's a different culture. That's like a legal culture thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Mhm.
Yeah. But okay, so all right, so you know, there's other types of, I think in general though, right, let's just, you know, put data sharing aside. Code sharing would be really, I think this is what people look at as immediately useful. If you contribute your code, your impact potentially is much larger. But also, like you were saying, transparency. It seems that you know, a lot of groups are finding, you know, there's this whole reproducibility crisis, partially because of people doing p-hacking and not pre-registering, but also it's because in their data, they don't report as many metrics as they could in terms of stability and things like that. Are you trying to, is there any way of fostering that? You know, I know that in the standards committee at OHBM, we're trying to say, oh, with every time series, you can get metrics and that, you know, relate to stability, you know, standard deviation, ghosting, outliers, things like that. And it'd be really useful. It's super useful for people to have that data if they're actually using it. Back to the data sharing, but if they're, you know, just even reporting it, like I could imagine, like you do a pre-registered study and then you say, oh, we didn't find this, but look, you know, this data had these metrics that were kind of not the best. And we did what we could to correct it, but it wasn't the best. And that sort of like points to that, as opposed to saying there's some problem with fMRI or something like that. It's more the time series. You know, it'd be nice to report metrics with your papers as well. So starting standards or something like that. But these are all ideas that I'm just, you know.
I think it's good ideas. I'm not sure what if I can say much more about it than that. Yeah. There are some standards for sharing, or not for sharing, for reporting fMRI data, for example, right? I always have to look it up.
Yeah. So just as a quick example. So just to back, I mean, I didn't mean to diverge that too much, but I think what people I think would be interested in hearing is, like, you're designing, you know, you design studies all the time. And so how actually are you designing the study differently with open science practices versus let's say, you know, this were 10 years ago or whatever. How is your thought process different, and how does it help your how, you know, practically speaking, how does it help?
So I think what can be done, but not like it's not necessarily done yet, but if you do all the work that you tend to do after data acquisition, thinking of the statistical model that you're going to use, what corrections, how to define your outliers, etc. If you do all that thinking already in advance, then I think you have a much more transparent and robust study also. And this is ideally what pre-registration helps you to do, to define all these things beforehand. It just makes the process before data acquisition a bit longer. It will make the process of data analysis a bit more concrete, I would say. And I was going to refer to the COBIDAS guidelines for, because a statement on how to report neuroimaging research. I'm honestly not aware if, like, these metrics that you mentioned, whether they are also mentioned in there, or that these are additional.
Yeah, believe it or not, I just interviewed, I'm actually working a little bit with the COBIDAS people, like Tom Nichols, and they're starting thinking about a COBIDAS 2, and this is one of the things that they want to do.
That's interesting. Yeah, that would be super relevant.
Yeah. So I really like your answer though regarding how it helps people. And it's important to emphasize this, is that it really, you know, it's not just something extra you have to do in terms of pre-registration. Yes, it is, but it's fostering good practices where you're thinking carefully about the analysis. You're thinking it all through up front.
It saves you a lot of thinking later.
Yeah, and not only your analyses, but what I also realized also the theories that you're building on. So what kind of theories would have what kind of predictions, and you think it's all clear, and then as soon as you're really starting to write it down and starting to think about it more and more, first you get a lot more confused. At least that's what happened with me. And then in the end, I think it's just very helpful to do all this thinking beforehand and not only afterwards. Of course, you also need to do it afterwards, and that's also very valuable. But to look at your theories and what kind of predictions that they would generate, I think that's also very helpful. And another thing that I often think about is actually this code sharing. So as soon as you start writing code with the idea in the back of your head that you're going to share this, you're going to be so much more meticulous in how you document stuff and how you comment stuff. And that will just make you very, very happy in 2 years.
Yeah, so it's just basically having good enforcing good practices, things that people should be doing anyway, and enforcing or trying to create a culture where they do this up front. And this is a way of showing that they're doing this up front. Yeah, I totally agree. And if they share their data, they'll make it a little bit more, they'll document it better. Their code, they'll document better, they'll write better. And if they pre-register their data, they'll think more carefully about it up front.
But the question is whether enforcing would be necessary. So I would envision a scientific culture in which we do not need to enforce certain practices, in the sense that we tell people that they have to, because otherwise they, I don't know, don't get into a certain, they don't get a certain prize, or they don't get grant money or something like that.
Right.
Nice badge.
We have a research, exactly, or a badge. But we have a research culture in which we can just do these kind of things because we want to do them, because we know that these are ethical things to do, because we enjoy them, because it's not only the system of publish and perish and the individuals getting played out against each other, but if we would have, for example, or if we were to have a more collaborative research culture in which people also have a little bit more stable working conditions, I think those are all things that all play together in, and that it would be so much more fruitful to change those things than to enforce.
Totally agreed.
It goes back to the incentive question, and the incentive is part of changing the culture is the incentive as well. People generally like to do what people in general think is good.
But that cultural change is on its way, and I have good hopes that is going to come through. And this gets back to your point about the networks and to join forces with other initiatives. I think that's very important to do, to not be an isolated initiative. Maybe this has to be the case for some because there's not many people or other initiatives around, but it totally pays off to look around carefully in your institute, in your university, in your town, in Europe, like at all levels, you can find like-minded people or initiatives, and at least connect, see what they're doing, how they share resources, and maybe even start networks. So in Germany, there are 2 networks like that. It's relatively new, I would say. So there were the initiatives before the networks, of course, but it's starting to become more important to join forces in these networks. I think we can have much bigger impact like that. And maybe one other point here to mention is that you can think of researchers trying to foster open science and having these initiatives. But it's also very important to think of other stakeholders here, like funding agencies, publishers, politics, And I think it's very important to also exchange with them. This was recently done in Berlin. So different stakeholders were invited to a joint discussion, and that was very insightful. So there's the topic of open science and good scientific practice. Like, these different stakeholders have different focus points, and it's very good to hear about these different focus points, but also about the commonalities or the shared focus points that we have. And together, I think we can really make a difference. That's my hope.
Yeah. Also, these networks, it gives you also maybe a bigger sense of belonging or so. This gets a little bit like philosophical, but as soon as you also realize that there are so many other people doing very similar things, and you actually start interacting with them, I think it gives also energy to an initiative.
Yeah,
very much so.
And it seems like you're right at the edge of something bigger happening. Definitely. I think everyone's aware of these things, and they keep on, with OHBM, at least it's also trying to be pushed. And yeah, I think it can do nothing but grow. And I think that people have to realize as well that, once again, I think more people are being incentivized, but there are people still, and it's important to emphasize that doing things like registration and being transparent is not necessarily opposed to, a lot of people do science where they look for serendipitous things to happen. Sometimes you might have an unexpected result. That's something significant, and there's nothing to stop one from designing a study based on some observation for pursuing that hypothesis. Then, so
no, absolutely not.
We should not stop
part of
doing
the scientific
that.
process, right? I mean,
right.
Also,
and here
you have to generate hypotheses. You cannot only be testing hypotheses; you have to generate them. So you need also these, theory building, data collection, data analysis, and also thoughts, also thinking.
So this sometimes gets forgotten a little bit in certain open science discussions, because it's all about reproducing findings. Of course, you want to also reproduce exploratory findings subsequently. But so there should definitely still be room for exploratory work, for good, well-funded, how do you say that?
Well-designed.
Well-designed exploratory work, of course.
Yes.
And that's also a task for funders to keep funding that, or fund that maybe even more. And for the researchers to be very clear about what kind of research they're doing.
And for everyone.
Okay.
And for all open science advocates to also not forget this. Be very clear that this is a very important part of science, and that no one wants to ask people to stop doing that.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there's always a certain amount of, even at the beginning of a study, sometimes you have a pilot study and you're just sort of iterating to work out some of the kinks and some of the issues and the problems, and that's all still good. It's just a matter of sort of getting it settled, and then you do pre-registration. So it's never.
And it's just a matter of being transparent, right? You can document everything, and as long as you're doing that, there's
Right, and that's actually a really important thing to. Yeah, I totally agree. So where do you see this? So just as we get close to the end here, so I mean, obviously this is also adaptable to an ever-changing landscape of methods as well, and as the methods get more sophisticated, hopefully, if anything, it will allow the field to adapt faster, since things are so transparent, and go from there. But where do you see this? I mean, the ultimate goal is what? I mean, what would you imagine, like, this movement, is growing, and maybe in 20 years, let's say it keeps on developing. How do you think science might look different in 20 years if this keeps on going the way you want? How would it be transformed? I mean, I know it's kind of an open, it's not, there's no right answer. It's just sort of speculate. The whole point is to sort of speculate you know, it's good to be pushing this, but let's say you've arrived. What's the end?
The end.
Or what's the state of like, oh, this is, we're finally, the world is doing science properly, or whatever. You'll never reach that point. Well, nobody ever reaches that point. But what would you imagine, like, for instance, OHBM or the brain mapping community? You know, obviously an answer would be everyone would be doing this in some sense, but I guess the question is more along the lines of, you know, how is science transformed by this?
So I think Gisela has a nice answer to this, and I would also have some things in mind to reply to your question.
Yeah, so like in the sense of what would be an ideal open science community, or how would the scientific landscape look like? So for me, actually, diversity and equity is a very important point. So what I think we really need is a community, on the one hand, in which people are kind. I think kindness is very important. Open for all kinds of different voices, and also critical voices, so that criticism can be heard, be interacted with in a kind and constructive manner, that it's not only the most powerful people that can talk, but that everyone's is heard. So I don't think that open science can really truly work if we don't also open up science and include these diverse voices, such that we can be also aware of different kind of needs that different people in different situations might need. So if we want sort of open science to take over the world, which I think would be a good thing, we do need this feeling that everyone is invited to contribute and can feel also included, and therefore willing to take part in it. Yeah, so that can mean that there are different focuses for different people from different fields, or different parts of the world, or different kind of research cultures. And for example, for some, pre-registration will be important and helpful, and for others, they might choose other ways to transparently document. And what I think is that this sort of the possibility to have this dialogue is really important. And yeah, so this what I said, this kindness, but also collaboration. So what I think is that currently the scientific culture is still quite individualized. So I think what we need is a lot more collaboration, and probably for that we also need, so we need definitely different incentives, different ways how to also review people. If this is the right word for that. And
research assessment, I think, is what you're looking for, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So different ways of research assessment, and probably also more job security, such that people can also take time to implement certain practices, take time to, for example, spend 1 or 2 years only on exploratory research, or on theory building, or on other things that just take a lot of time, and that might be risky, and not end up with a fancy Nature paper, but be in the end very valuable.
That's, yeah.
I'm totally with you on that, Gisela. And I was thinking of some additional concrete things that I would like to see, more solutions to problems or challenges that we have at the moment, I think. So one big thing that I would love to see changed, I'm not sure how, but if we could work towards a different publication system that is more modern and more relying on current technological developments, rather than this archaic system of publication that's still, that's still like is a leftover from the time that we had to read papers on paper, articles on paper. I think there big reform is very welcome. There's ideas about that, just no clear one path yet. I think people are trying out different things. There's different kinds of publication models now, but it would be good to have maybe at some point some kind of concrete path to take, so that people don't get lost in all the many possibilities. And that's another thing that I think is in danger about going the open science road, if you want to call it like that, that it's still quite overwhelming. We touched upon the topic of open science like as a vague term, or there's many things that fall under open science, and that can be a bit overwhelming. Also, what it can also be overwhelming, I think, is like with increased transparency comes more information out there that can be assessed. Will it all be assessed? Does it have to be all peer reviewed? How do we deal with that huge increase in publicly available information? And how do we make sure that all that information is good, of good quality, so that we can actually work with that? I think these are very important challenges that that require some more developments. I know there are some developments there already from some journals or from in different ways, but there we need to make steps, and I think we can greatly benefit from the technological developments that are there. That's just to add. Yeah,
no, I see what you're saying, and I totally agree. I with both of you. There's journals. I mean, like not only the publication system, but I mean, there's journals like, I'm trying to get this one thing helping out with this journal called Aperture. It's sort of it's an open access, but it's also you can share, you can write about code or data, or you could even include scripts. You can have pre-registered studies, whatever. So it's an attempt to sort of make a sort of open up the publishing. But there's many different publishing models also that you could take as far as that. But one thing actually that you didn't mention that is a wide open can of worms as well. And also, I totally agree with making science, not only more open and more transparent, but also more accessible. Changing the culture of access to different groups, to different nationalities, different. I think that we're attempting, and that we can only benefit from that. And there's ways of doing that sort of feed into the whole open science philosophy. But one thing that isn't really talked about that much, but I think it's kind of a broken system. At least this is myself speaking, just my own opinion, is the funding system. At Max Planck and the NIH, we're kind of lucky in some sense where we have some sort of fixed budget, which allows us a certain amount of stability to sort of explore open-ended, sort of do exploratory or very careful, a little bit maybe less high impact and more base establishing sort of research. But the incentives for applying for people in the extramural world are constantly applying for grants, and it's constantly motivating them to have these super high impact brand new ideas, and which sort of forces people into doing sometimes a type of science that might not be good in the long run. So potentially. So but that's a bigger question. I'm not about to change the granting system.
But I think that touches upon what Gisela said about we need different ways of research assessment, at least not just at the funding level, but that's an important part where research assessment should be done better than just looking at these wrong metrics, basically. That could make a big difference already if we get a cultural shift there. It's on its way. We're not there yet. Just hope that we can speed that up a little bit by not just keeping initiatives grassroots, but really also reaching more senior people who actually do play a role on reviewing committees, who do play a role in hiring people. So this way also grassroots initiatives can make a difference, but you have to actively try to reach further than just the grassroots.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, it'll be both bottom up and top down. And I think slowly but surely people, you know, even funding agencies will start to, I mean, I think they're already doing that. I mean, the whole, you know, large database studies, connectome study, and you know, at least in the States and other
replication studies also. So there are examples of funding agencies explicitly calling for replication studies. It's happening. It's very slow, and of course, there's never enough money.
Yeah, there's never enough money, and
fund everyone.
And you want to be able to put the money in the place where it has the most impact, and it's tricky to balance that with having people doing work that doesn't always look like it's the most impact in the short run, but it's a long term. Yeah.
Exactly, because that's the thing, right? We do want to fund research that's most impactful, but how do you assess which research is most impactful if these are the fancy stories that might not replicate, or do we want a more rigorous kind of research culture? And maybe we want both, right? Maybe we want a combination of these kind of things. But then it's important that at the level of the people that are reviewing, for example, grant proposals, but also job applications, that they take into account these sort of different possibilities of how you can be scientifically impactful.
Yes.
Exactly. So here there's quite some writing talking about hidden labor of researchers, especially early career researchers, that should be acknowledged. We have to find ways of acknowledging that in a meaningful way. That is on its way, and it's necessary.
Yeah, and also how do you acknowledge, for example, people that write R packages or other kinds of freely available software? I mean, this is hugely important for the scientific community. So this should also be weighed accordingly. But
but also like other things that are even more hidden, like good mentoring of students, or like taking part in these kind of engaging in these kind of initiatives that we build on. Building on a healthier research culture, these things that basically only your direct colleagues might be aware of, and maybe they can tell, they can write about it in reference letters, but that's not good enough to get you through a first round of applications somewhere. So there needs to be a better way of getting at also these hidden labors that are really quite, like, you cannot show, oh, here I have done this code or this R package that you can link to, but what's your role in mentoring students that are actually not yours, for example?
Or trying to change the research culture, and that do take part in a lot of efforts for that. And then I think always, like, things with mentoring or sort of like the more organizational work, you also always have to keep in mind, like, who are the people that are usually doing this, and how does this also interact with different minority groups?
For sure.
Yeah, maybe funding more. I mean, I think there is some going on, but in terms of funding infrastructure in all ways, like everything from analysis methods to ways of sharing to all these things that help in the long run.
Yeah, that's it, right? We have to think long term. Like, we have to think of a viable research culture, and not just of the short term successes that we can have.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just addicted to publishing, I would dare to say.
Right. Okay, a lot covered today. And I'm sure this will, I mean, we've gone everything from, done everything from talking about your own getting started to changing the world, at least starting to. And that's great. All right, well, and with that, then I'd just like to thank the both of you.
Neurosalience is brought to you by the Organization for Human Brain Mapping and is produced by Anastasia Brovkin, Ekaterina Dobrikova, Katie Moran, Niels Mullert, Kevin Seatek, and me, Rachel Stickland.